Thank you. So yeah, as Dean mentioned, I'm in from Austin, Texas. I've been on a bit of a world tour. I was up in Amsterdam, Zurich, Munich, Cape Town before this. So this is, it's great to have gotten here. So one of the things about being from Texas is that when I say that I have been in advocacy and evangelism for quite some time, well, evangelism means something very special in Texas, hence a little bit of a variation on the title. But as I got started in that was about 4.5 years ago. We brought an intern into our team, and the way that she learned continuous integration and delivery really kind of set a spark in my mind about maybe some of the gaps we have in the industry about how we all learn CI/CD. So Antonia, in fact, she's still with Atlassian. We actually collaborated on the content for this, and so there will be several Antonia stories in here. And the first one is when she joined our team as an intern. And really it was like she's learning about Atlassian and what it means to be a part of our culture. There's a lot to that. She was learning for the first time how to be part of an agile team and what is even a stand-up. So it was also her first time with Git, and I don't know if you all remember your first time with Git, but she had lots of mistakes where she had to come to us and say, I think I deleted everything. No, it's okay, it's distributed version control system, it's okay. But meanwhile, right, with all of that learning going on, we were using Bamboo to do continuous integration and continuous delivery, and it was just kind of working silently in the background. She really didn't have a lot of exposure to it. The more senior folks on the team had set that up and gotten it working before she even joined the team. And I think while that's one intern's experience, I think that there's something common about this idea, and it's that developers don't study continuous integration so much as they absorb it. And frankly, I maybe even not completely, because I think part of it is that there's this terrible term here. Part of it is that there's this continuous idea, and are we checking in continuously? I mean, doesn't it only run when I do a commit? And then there's what's integration. I mean, everything in development is integration, isn't it? I mean, so what do these terms mean? Overall, I think this is something that's describing a solution in terms of a problem that few of us really have come to understand well. So, what I think is happening here is that people have learned good habits, or mostly good habits, but not necessarily the principles, and I think this is where we can get a little bit deeper. So I'll begin with some of these basic principles. I know they're going to sound, like you'll find them familiar, but bear with me because eventually we'll get to some of the things that I think teams could improve upon. So first of all, why do I know this is still a problem? The State of DevOps report for 2018 is still indicating that for medium and low performers, this is, in total, 52% of all of the industry is basically deploying only once per week and once per month. And to me, that's not really the kind of the frequency that we really could be up to. Okay, so let's get to what do we mean by continuous. Let's start with an idea of batch size. And let's step back from code for a minute to talk about something a little bit more fun. Let's talk about a brewery. We're going to make some beer. So we're going to put all of these ingredients into a giant vat, mix them together, and somewhere along the way, bad things can happen. We could be creating poison, and this is a long and involved process. So if you don't detect that poison until the very end, then we could have wasted a lot of time and effort and resources. So if we really just kind of step back from that, it's about don't bite off more than you can chew. And in the software world, we're talking about smaller pieces, smaller changes to our code, and that's what helps the code get built faster and better. So by a show of hands, let's talk about how big our batches are. How many folks have branches that last longer than 2 days? Yeah, that's still quite a lot. Now, I'll come back to why 2 days matters, but let's just pause there. Thanks for the honesty. So everyone, if that's the idea behind continuous, is this smaller and smaller batches, what's the idea behind integration? So let's imagine all of us in this room, we're working on one book, we each have our chapter, we wait to the end to put all of the chapters together. Is there any chance that book is going to be cohesive? Not a lot, right? So, if we take that to the code world, what is the point of integration we're talking about? We're effectively talking about merging. So how many of you still have painful merges? Yeah, again, thanks for the honesty. Okay, so if that's the kind of sets the stage about continuous and integration, this is the kind of pitch that we get in contrast. On the left side, we have the world without continuous integration. It's like this traffic jam of merge conflicts. In fact, Martin Fowler called the problems that we see in integration at the point of merge, he called them integration episodes. I don't know, just something, makes it really sound painful. Now, life with continuous integration, obviously, CI is some kind of, like living without any of those problems and some kind of utopia. Yeah, not so much. The slide proposes a binary, but reality is not really so simple, is it? So I know that, from working on several software development teams, that it's really much more like Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill for eternity. And that's because you can live in the right side state for a while, but things happen. You have a disruption, and you slip out of that state, and it takes some real effort to get back to where things are less painful. So you have to take the effort to make sure that the CI system is put back into the working state again. So I want to assure people that CI isn't a perfect state, that somebody who isn't you gets to live in. It's okay, we're all constantly learning. So one of the biggest things that makes continuous integration kind of slip out of that good state is that branches go on for too long. And that's because long branches feel more like integration by car crash than it is something smooth and easy to do. Now, the State of DevOps report explains that trunk-based development, where all of the commits are really integrated as continuously as you can get, it kind of qualifies it for what it means in the Git world, where branching and merging are much easier. And the qualification they make is that it should be a day. Now, inside of Atlassian, the average branch lasts about 2 days, so we're not perfect either. And if you think about a bell curve, okay, there's 50% are lasting longer than even that. But these are just benchmarks. I don't let's not over exaggerate what these are about. The key idea here is that the longer the branches live, the more potential for pain in merging. Okay, so that's continuous integration. What is CD? Okay, show of hands, continuous deployment, continuous delivery, compact disk, certificate of deposit. Okay, right, it's a trick question, right? Because all of them are right in the right context. But in software development, we usually mean the top two. And what's the difference? The main difference is whether or not you have to click a button. So in continuous deployment, you're clicking a button right before things get into production, and that, and in continuous delivery, things are moving along automatically for every commit, as long as they pass all of the tests. And the key thing here in this diagram is this idea of environments, that we set up production, staging, and this kind of hidden one here on the left with development. But why are there so many? Well, it's like bulkheads in a ship. And if you have a problem in the dev world, the bulkheads are going to prevent the spillover into the other environments and right into a painful user experience. So it prevents the whole thing from flooding, and overall, we would consider it a safety measure. So speaking of safety, this brings us back to the beer analogy. Now, okay, don't worry, it's only Heineken here, but if you use bottles that are too thin, they're going to break in transport. Or if you hire a terrible driver, you might get this kind of episode here. In the brewery stage, we were really talking about testing the beer often. But in a delivery model, in the deployment world, we're really talking about testing the logistics often. Okay? In real beer, it's not like it changes that often. You put the bottles in the crates, and put the crates on a competent driver's truck, and everything's going to work out fine. But in the software world, it's as if the bottles are changing shape and size almost constantly. A long time ago, Atlassian used to deliver our software as a jar file that you would deploy into a web server. And these days, more customers are asking for our software inside of a Docker containers. So that's how delivery vessels are changing in shape and size. And there's another difference between beer and software, and it's that we can separate deployment from release. So let's be clear here. What is a release? A release is when you make features available to customers, And a deployment is more the technical side, moving code into production. Now, how can we separate that? Well, if you have a monolith, I would recommend starting with this idea of blue-green deployments. Now, this is a term that has been coined by Dave Farley and Jez Humble in their book on continuous delivery. The names themselves are somewhat arbitrary. Sometimes you hear it called by other things. But there's a key idea here, and it breaks from that older idea that I was showing in terms of sequential environments, where there are actually two things in production at the same time. The difference between production and staging is just where this router points. So, and that just goes to show all problems in computer science can be solved by another level of indirection. Okay, so let's step back from the router. The general idea is that revealing features to customers can be put behind some kind of toggle, something external to the software itself. So another way to separate deployment from release is to put switches in the code as feature flags. Now I know how powerful that is because a few years back I worked on the integration between AWS CodeStar and Jira. And we wanted to announce this thing while I was standing on stage telling developers, okay, right now you can go try this integration out. There's no way I would have had the confidence to be on stage if we had to go through a full deployment of those things just to get those features released. So fortunately, it was behind a feature flag. We had been able to look at all of that code behind our feature flag for quite some months, and then during the presentation, somebody flips a switch and it's available. Now, if you're thinking that blue-green deployments or feature flags sound like a lot of work, well, you're right. There's, both introduce some constraints and complexity. But if we think about it, so does continuous integration, like having those short times between integrations. For constraints, we have to be mindful of breaking changes. For example, you can't make every database change all in one go. You sometimes have to phase in those changes. Inside of Atlassian, we've been using some patterns here where some database changes require as many as 5 deployments so that we can safely stage in all of those changes. For complexity, you have to be mindful of parallel logic paths. So, for example, if a feature flag is basically an if statement, at some point, eventually you're only using one branch of that if statement, and then you're going to have to go back and make sure that you take out the if and the extraneous logic. So for both of these kind of approaches, expect to pay a technical cost. In the world of Atlassian, we've been working on something in Jira Cloud that is the migration from our traditional kind of page-based user interface to more of a single-page application. There's already some benefits to usability and performance, so we're already seeing the payoff there. But there's some heavy load too, in that at any given time, there's a cluster of about 20 different feature flags that we have to manage. So one of the things that we do, we use a third-party product. We use LaunchDarkly to keep track of all of the feature flags that we have available for that, and then to roll them out to different sets of users. But that's not all. We can't just grab some third-party product and be done with it. We've also discovered that we really have to do some work inside of our product to make sense of that. When we're in support scenarios, we need to understand what one user is experiencing versus another user. So we had to write an API into Jira itself to make sure that we could do that kind of comparison. We also have code conventions that help us find and remove those feature flags when we're done with them. So in both CD techniques, we should recall the importance of batch size, because making more and small changes to a database or to a user interface is really a safety measure over efficiency. You have to be kind of clear about that. But that's really kind of a short-term thing. I think in the long run, it's actually better for both. Because small batches reduce the amount of disruption. From emergency scenarios, we make it much easier to flip the switch back to what is a known good working state. And also small experimental changes mean that we actually reduce the flow of bugs because users are rarely exposed to really jarring changes. Okay, so we're back to another false dichotomy. And this one is similar to continuous integration for good reason. One of the key ideas in this slide is this configuration drift. So if in the continuous integration world, our problem is the merges, it's really that configurations in environments can drift out of sync with each other. If I bring back that bulkhead analogy, it's as if the bulkheads don't line up anymore, and so you can't even open up the doors and move through the ship at all. Now, this reminds me of a time when I had just moved to Austin. I was sitting near the Bitbucket team on a Friday afternoon watching Twitter, and I start to see some messages come through from some of our customers saying, Bitbucket is down, it looks like I'm going home. So that gets me kind of curious. This is my first chance to see the Bitbucket team respond to a real disaster like this. And so I turn around with curiosity, and I kind of expect everybody to be running around like crazy, figuring out what's going wrong and trying to fix the thing so that they can get home. But no, actually, they have as much curiosity as I do about it. But they're standing around some of the dashboards that they use on a regular basis, pointing, maybe saying, oh, look at the queues drain and watch the dials wiggle. And I'm kind of baffled for a moment. And then I realize, okay, but we have continuous delivery. They wouldn't be pushing out changes on a Friday afternoon if they thought there was a risk that they would have to work over the weekend. And sure enough, Bitbucket was back up and running 15 minutes later, perhaps to the chagrin of all of those developers that went home early. So I think there's something here about like practice makes perfect. There's, when you do these deployments on a very frequent basis, you get better at managing those configurations across environments. And that means you can have the confidence to deploy at any time. So I know we've been talking about CI/CD. I like this quote about DevOps because it really helps bring us back to more what are the thoughts, the principles, the culture here. A lot of folks in the CI/CD world do get hung up on the technology. Like, hey, I've got Jenkins running, so therefore I must be doing CI. But I want you to step beyond that because of what this says. DevOps isn't about automation, just as astronomy isn't about telescopes. So we have to understand the CI/CD in kind of more than just automation. I think of it more like a kind of cybernetic cycle, something that we have to be involved in. So here's where we start to switch. We're going to go into the details a little bit more, but let me paint a kind of high-level picture of CI/CD. I think it's really kind of three main functions. We want to detect. So if we go back to our brewery example, we're talking about detecting poison as soon and as often as we can. There's deliver. That's making sure that our product gets into production, or maybe not production, but some working environment where we can see it running, because everybody values getting a peek at the software. And then there's the key point, communicate. So when detect and deliver go wrong, we want to make sure that people get informed, that they can jump on and fix problems that happen quickly. So let's take an example flow through some tools. So from the Bitbucket side, that's our Git repository management solution, but you could be using GitHub, GitLab, whatever. Bamboo, and again, it's just an example flow, so it might as well be Jenkins. The CI/CD server is going to detect when there are changes in Bitbucket. It's going to do all of these detection things. Then it's going to do the delivery work. It's going to package that up and put it into some environment. And when either of those go wrong, you have the chance to communicate that in several channels. So it's not just about having the result in the CI/CD tool, but available in your chat tool where people can act on it more quickly, or in the project management tool where, for example, for Jira Software, that's going to be a developer panel where you see whether the builds are passing or failing per issue, or in Bitbucket where you're going to see pass-fail results for every commit in every context. So that means for branches, for PRs, all of that helps keep everybody informed and make the right choices about what they're doing. But that's the level at which I think everybody kind of gets CI/CD. I don't think people are really assembling things wrong at that level, but it's in this next layer where we start to hear some of the problems. So one is that when we're talking about detection, we have to remember that CI/CD servers don't do the detection themselves. They're just kind of coordinators for that work. So we have to do some work on our own. It's kind of a do-it-yourself process here. And one of those things is with automated testing. And I still see too many teams with low test coverage. And I know one of the immediate reactions to that is, okay, we put code coverage measurement on it, and then let's get to 100%. But that just drives people to create more kind of artificial tests. And that means the tests themselves aren't valuable. You can't make sense of what they're doing because all they're trying to do is find some code path somewhere. Yes, and I think what we really want to have is just really more a confidence that everything still works as expected when we make changes. And I just don't know of any other way to do this right now than the technique of test-driven development, or TDD. So I think that's where, where people are still not quite doing the whole thing there. That means writing test automation before you write the code itself. Now I know how weird this is because I once worked with a colleague. We brought him out of consulting where all of the pressures were get the work done as fast as possible, and when you're done, that's it. There's like no more ongoing work with the customer. It's very project-oriented work. But when we brought him into a product team, we had to insist you're going to do TDD. And I get to watch the process as he kind of learned how to come to grips with this. In the very first week, he was constantly complaining bitterly about, I just don't see how we're going to hit the deadlines. You keep making me do all of this test work. What is going on here? Like, let's, can we quit this? No, you have to keep going. Second week, he's still complaining a bit. Third week, he starts to be quiet, maybe a little half smile on his face. And by the fourth week, he's saying to us, I can't believe I worked any other way. See, what had happened is he had started to build up some real confidence that he could continue the pace of change that he would enjoy in these very short engagements. So now, even in week 4, he's feeling just as productive and sure that all 4 weeks are still working right. So another common problem is that people don't really have coding standards, and they're just kind of letting every developer do whatever. Now, I know it's a touchy subject and downright political when it comes to tabs or spaces, but the solution isn't just have coding standards. I think it's really much more having a robot enforce the coding standards that are expressed in configuration in the code repository. That means if somebody does change the standard from tabs to spaces, you know who did it and when. Now, if I come back to poor Antonia, who was at the beginning of the story, there was a time when she was working on a rewrite of our developer.atlassian.com site, and due to a misplaced comma, she crashed the entire site. Now, the thing was, we were all at fault. We all had the chance to review her code, but catching just one missing comma, that's really tedious. And the thing is that what we really should have been doing is using a linter. It's just such a simple thing to do. Now, another thing that I think is a problem is that security is an afterthought. So I hope folks have caught that like about 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was a severe Docker bug that allowed code to break out of containers and potentially run in another. I see some heads shaking. So good. Hopefully folks have caught that and patched it. But that's a kind of example of, that's really kind of out of our control. It always feels like it's somebody else's job. And it's such a constantly moving target, so it's definitely something that human beings have to be involved in. But the space is so broad that we would just be remiss if we did not use robots to help check our code as much as possible. Inside of Atlassian, we use a product called SourceClear to check our downstream open source dependencies. Now, I don't know if folks here have written Jira plugins. It's kind of an involved process, but there are the fan out for the things that you write inside of Jira is really pretty incredible. There's a lot of downstream things. So historically, our approach to those security vulnerabilities would have been taken, we make sure to take high priority things as completely urgent. We would make sure to drop everything and fix those kinds of things. But that left a lot of low and medium issues still hanging out there. Recently, we were actually able to have an internal celebration when we reduced the number of SourceClear issues down to 0. So it takes some discipline, but with the right tools in place, you can really see where you need to go there. So another piece is this deliver. And if, just like for detection, developers still have to do some things to make sure they're detecting the right problems, well, delivery has that too. That means there are developers who have to write some code in order to make sure that it gets packaged and configured and deployed correctly. One of the things about packaging, comes back to poor Antonia, who, while working on this developer site, we were using Python and its package manager pip. And things got painful one day when we discovered we really weren't tracking which versions of the dependencies we had, and suddenly things just weren't working anymore. And it actually wasn't completely consistent because it was working on some laptops and not others. Well, after a day of detective work, we really got down to which versions we were using. We pinned those in a very specific file, and I think we were able to get going again. But I think that's not just the case for Python or pip or Ruby and the gems that you have to install there. They're really, in any language, I just don't see enough discipline going on here. And an example of this is this Equifax breach that happened, I guess that's maybe 6 months or a year ago now, was due to a package that had known vulnerabilities in it. It was a high vulnerability. They just did not have the discipline to keep patching things on a regular basis. So there's this balance here. You know, on one hand, we have to be careful of using latest, because if we don't pin at all, we get into an unstable situation. On the other hand, if we let things lag too long, well, then we get into security vulnerability. So there's a middle ground that we have to find with packaging. So another key difference between CI and CD is whether you care about configuration. CD typically emphasizes having these production-like environments where you can test your code. But I think it's almost as if production-like environment is too subtle for some folks, because I see a lot of teams that still have no automation across their environments, and so all of that configuration management is still done by hand, which is just the recipe for configuration drift. And then kind of related to that, it's like the other side of it is, if people are doing it by hand, then how are they doing their audit trail? And we all work in some, or have worked with some big companies where the audit trail is maintained by tickets and documentation and kind of a traditional change management approach. But I think that still just leads to a works on my machine kind of attitude. And when we were working as a team with Antonia, we insisted that we would do continuous delivery, and that meant that we took that excuse away entirely. With infrastructure as code, it meant that every commit that we were doing would eventually wind up in production. So our audit trail was the version control system. It's just a lot more reliable to depend on it. The other thing is that CI/CD servers, like Bamboo, detect when they detect these failures in their detection mechanisms or failure to deploy, then how do they get that information out? One of the things we have to be aware of is that if you've used a unit testing framework, there's a kind of pattern you'll have observed there. Maybe not consciously, but when you run your unit test, you get pretty much just a very simple check mark when things pass. But if things fail, that's where you get this explosion of information. Which unit test failed and where it is in your suite, stack trace that indicates what went wrong. And so I think there's a pattern here that we should be thinking about for CI/CD as well, that is passing is quiet and failing is noisy. So I think that's what we want from our CI/CD in general. And one of those reasons is that we really have to be kind of conscious to avoid noise. Because when we have too many signals coming at us, then we start to ignore them. I think CI is the reason why I become so sensitive when other people's fuel gauge indicators go red in their car, right? I become so sensitive to is he gonna start to not pay attention to that? I wanna make sure that we get into the gas station. Now, logically, I know there's a buffer, but it's sort of the principle of the matter that really gets me. I just don't want people leaving those things for too long. There's a thought from the lean manufacturing world called stop the line. And so in a manufacturing facility like Toyota, when they hit a problem that's manufacturing related, they literally pull a cord, and then they have a certain amount of time to work out that problem. And if it goes too long, they will literally stop the production for the entire line. I think we need that kind of thinking inside of software development, because I still see developers piling on commits after a build has gone bad. And that just makes it that much harder to find and fix the problem that occurred in the first place. So and then we kind of get into this idea that, for build results, maybe this is not true for everyone, but they're often behind a kind of information barricade. So if we think about the people have to sit down, they have to log in, they have to find the right URL and the right tool, then they have to find the right report to get the result, then that's a barrier to getting the right information. Now, okay, if you do this every day, and you know what, maybe if it's not preventing you from fixing failed builds fast, great. But if you are having a problem there, I highly recommend taking advantage of information radiators, like real-world stuff that you can buy from Internet of Things. Get something, plug it in. It's good for everyone. Even people who don't have a login or even a chair can see the build results as they occur. That means it's super easy to understand what's going on for anyone. When I gave this talk in Zurich, I actually did a little bit of research and discovered a creative team that had built a cuckoo clock that they could plug in and get build results from. So it's something fun to do. So I shared a lot of stories around these different areas. Let me just zoom in on the takeaways for you. I understand if a lot of these feel really basic, but I think the real problem is that people aren't doing all of them. So find something on this list to start doing and try it out tomorrow. First is this idea of limiting batch size. And my suggestion here is to really get strict with this. Keep your branches to 2 days or less. Try feature flags. Really the important thing is the decoupling of deployment from release, but I think feature flags have become a pretty well-established way to do that. Test first. Write your tests before your code. I think that's the way you get really high test coverage results. Have coding standards. Use static analysis tools, but importantly, keep that configuration in the repo. Pin packages to specific versions. The important thing there is to make sure that your builds are reproducible. Manage configuration. That's across environments. Make sure that you're avoiding configuration drift. That should be a very high priority. Again, audit trail. I know folks have these with tickets and documentation. No, I want folks using version control as the source of truth. And of course, better communication. The build bunnies were the example that I gave there, but use real-world information radiators where you can. So if you've mastered those 8 and you still want more, we have this wonderful site for continuous delivery. There's lots of good advice there. Otherwise, I'm open for questions here. And I do have one more thing though, don't I, Dean? So I guess at the Obsidian booth, we're giving out t-shirts after this. So please tweet at Obsidian and your t-shirt size, and then you can head to the booth and pick one up. So now for questions, yes. Yes.
So I'm one of those guys that work for the big company.
Yeah.
And we still run the change management process. And I'm just wanting to know, how do you then accommodate your change management process? Because you've got KPMG and you've got all these other guys that want to show value to that big company, and they interrogate this process called continuous delivery, matching up to your change management. How do you guys deal with this when you almost run a project for these big companies?
Yeah, the big company thing is always hard. There's lots of culture clash going on in that. So I make no claims that any of these things are easy. But one of the things that we had to do as a company when we went public, this is like three and a half years ago, we had to really step up our game, meet some auditor requirements, and we spent a considerable amount of time teaching them that automated approaches would actually work. I think in the larger organizations, that's sort of the new role of change management and release management, that they have a role in being more like providing guidance for folks to help them understand what good change management and what good release management look like, much in the way that test management has changed for how testers participate in Agile. It's a tricky transition for us. One of the things I find interesting is how much ITIL 4 kind of changes and embraces a lot of what these ideas are. So maybe ITIL 4 is sort of a new source of inspiration that we can say, look, even your old standard for how to do these processes has started to say, separate deployment from release as an example. So, yeah. Other thoughts, questions?
All right, guys, if there's no other questions, we don't have to send Ian back right away. He's not flying back for a couple of days, but definitely head to the Obsidian stand and you can pick a ear. We do have one more question.
Hello. Sorry, you mentioned that you have, dev teams or developers normally get the jar file and deploy it on a Docker container. Is there a Docker container for Bitbucket or Atlassian or any Atlassian tools?
Yeah, that's history. So that was, you have to remember, like, more than 5 years ago. In the meantime, we've moved from the straight jar files or WAR files to having installers for pretty much everything. So if you want, you can get a zip installation. There's a jar in there, but it's not a mechanism that we recommend anymore. We had too many problems through support. Our mechanism's now really more like, we'd rather help you deploy the container for it.
Any other questions, guys?
I'm just interested in the blue-green deployment concept. Maybe we can chat after this, because there's a lot of IP stuff I want to ask you about.
Oh, yeah, sure. I think oops, did I go too far? The thing to do would be to go, if you want to talk a lot about it, yes, let's have a good conversation in the booth. But is there a quick question you can just kind of, for the whole audience to understand it better?
So we do a lot of database changes, and that's really biting us at the moment. And we just want to know, how do you guys sort of deal with the day-to-day from a continuous delivery perspective? And we speak to the devs and go, please don't make these changes all the time. But it's not working.
Yeah, so there are a couple things there. One is that, like, and it's back to the kind of org structures that you have. You probably have DBAs that want to gate all of the changes. Some of the tools that we've had to embrace are like encode database changes as file changes that you put into the repos. For us, then we kind of roll that out when you install a new version of our product. We run a migration that handles all of those changes. But we have to be very careful. That's where I come back to the constraints, that it means that developers can't go and drop a table like willy-nilly. They have to make very disciplined sets of changes. That becomes the new role of DBAs, to help make sure that those changes each increment is a safe change. Another thing that actually is not in this diagram, but you would find in the continuous delivery book, are some kind of alternate styles of this, like where the app in both blue and green actually point to the same database, kind of requiring you to work so safely that you don't make any changes that would affect existing data in a way that customers would see through the new or the old version. So there's, like having two sets of this code in production at the same time kind of puts some new kinds of complexity in there, but I think it's bringing a much necessary concept of safety into the production environment instead of all of the safety behind testing, right? So, and the trouble with that, if I come back to, that trade-off between efficiency and safety, is that it does take more time, and now you run into the kind of business folks who are like, but I wanted it yesterday, except that they wanted it yesterday, and then we had a production outage because you pushed us so fast. So safety actually pays off over time, but you kind of have to build up that sense of trust with the management level as well. Oh yes, more question.
So just a follow-up to that, something that I just thought of as you were talking about database changes, just so that I understand correctly. You used the example of, let's say, dropping a table. So you want to get to the point where this particular table is no longer used because it's redundant, you want to phase it out. Isn't that also where the iterative releases come in? You want to get to the point 6 releases from now where that table's gone, and you do a little bit of a change, you do a small change every release for the next 6 releases, so that you can slowly wean almost yourself off dependence on that table.
That's right. And it's still, some of the discipline is keeping track of, okay, which code is using which table. Some of the tools for database change management actually help keep track of that. Will kind of signal what's in use. Some of the most complex changes are, if you have first and last name, as one string, you want to split it. You're going to need 2 tables. You often have to write code that actually knows how to write to both at the same time. So it's like having feature flags almost in reverse, that you're kind of spitting out the data in multiple channels. Again, yes, there's complexity there, but your point is exactly right. The point is to make sure that the changes themselves are incremental and none of them individually is a breaking change.